The morning Eudora Hayes decided to enter the Millhaven Harvest Baking Contest. She had exactly 43 cents to her name, a cracked ceramic mixing bowl, and the kind of quiet desperation that settles into a woman's bones when she realizes that dignity alone cannot feed two small children through a Wyoming winter. She stood in her kitchen before the sun had fully climbed above the ridge, her dark hair pulled back into a practical braid, her apron already dusted with flour she could hardly afford to waste. The little house on the edge of Millhaven smelled of dried sage and old wood, and the morning light came through the window in long gold strips that made everything look prettier than it was. Eudora had learned that about morning light. It lied beautifully. Her son Thomas, who was 7 years old and already possessed of a seriousness that broke her heart a little, was eating a bowl of oatmeal at the table. Across from him, her daughter Clara, 5 years old and fierce as a summer storm, was pushing her oatmeal in slow circles and watching her mother with enormous brown eyes. "Are you making something special today, Mama?" Clara asked. "I am," Eudora said, and she kept her voice even and warm the way she always did, the way she had practiced in the months since Robert had died of fever 2 winters ago, leaving her with the house, a small debt to the general store, and the sudden terrible weight of being someone's everything when you were not entirely sure you could carry yourself. "I am making a pie for the contest in town." Thomas looked up from his oatmeal. "The one with the prize money. $50, Eudora said. The number felt enormous in her mouth. $50. It was enough to pay the back rent on the house to old Mr. Finch, enough to buy flour and salt and lard enough to last the winter, enough to put new soles on Thomas's boots before the first real snow came. $50 was the difference between surviving and collapsing, and Eudora Hayes had made up her mind that she would not collapse. Not today. Not in front of her children. The contest was being held on Saturday, 3 days away, as part of Millhaven's annual Harvest Festival. It was 1882, and Millhaven, Wyoming was the kind of small western town that took its festivals seriously, because the celebrations were one of the few things that made the isolation bearable. There would be a fiddle band and a horse race and tables set up in the main street with every variety of preserves and baked goods that the women of the county could produce, and at the end of the afternoon, a panel of judges would award a first prize of $50 to the best entry. Eudora had never entered before. In the years when Robert was alive, she hadn't needed to, but need had a way of pushing a person toward things they might otherwise have left alone. She began to work. Her recipe was not written down anywhere. It lived in her hands and in her memory, passed to her by her grandmother, a woman who had come west from Virginia with nothing but a cast-iron skillet and a knowledge of spices that she treated like sacred text. The pie was a brown sugar and apple custard, layered in a way that nobody else in Millhaven had ever quite managed to replicate, spiced with cinnamon and a touch of dried ginger and something else, a secret thing, that Eudora's grandmother had whispered to her on her deathbed like a confession. She peeled apples with steady hands. She rendered the lard she had been saving for something important and worked it into the flour until the dough was the right temperature, which she knew not by thermometer but by feel. She rolled the crust with a worn wooden pin on the floured board, lifting it carefully onto the pie dish she had brought out from the high shelf where she kept the things that mattered. Thomas finished his breakfast and came to stand beside her, watching with the solemn concentration of a boy who understood, even at 7, that something important was happening. "It smells good already," he said. "It'll smell better when it bakes," she promised him. She mixed the custard in the cracked ceramic bowl, whisking the eggs by hand until her arm ached, adding the brown sugar and the cream she had traded a pair of embroidered handkerchiefs for at the Dawson farm 2 days ago. She layered the sliced apples in careful overlapping fans, poured the custard in a slow stream, added the spices one by one, and finally, standing over the dish with the small jar of her grandmother's secret ingredient held in both hands like something precious, She added 3 pinches of the dried rose hip powder that gave the custard its color and its faint, extraordinary depth. She put it in the oven and sat down at the table and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel afraid. Then she stood up and began to clean. The walk into Millhaven on Saturday morning took 40 minutes on foot, which was the only way Eudora could manage it since the horse had been sold the previous spring. She carried the pie in a cloth-covered basket, walking carefully along the dirt road, while Thomas carried a smaller basket with their lunch, and Clara held her hand and skipped in intermittent bursts of energy that tugged at Eudora's arm and made her smile despite everything. The pie had come out beautifully. She had stood in front of the oven when she pulled it out, staring at the golden-brown crust and the set custard visible at the edges, and she had felt a surge of something that was not quite pride and not quite hope, but something that lived between them. She had set it to cool on the windowsill and gone to bed, and lain awake for 2 hours thinking about everything that could go wrong. And then she had fallen asleep and dreamed of her grandmother's kitchen in Virginia, which smelled of roses and brown sugar. Millhaven on Harvest Festival Day was transformed. The main street, which on ordinary days was a wide dirt thoroughfare lined with false front buildings, and the general store, and the livery stable and the saloon, had been decorated with bunting in red and gold, and the smells of roasting corn and fresh bread drifted from the tables set up along the boardwalk. Horses stood at their hitching posts decorated with ribbons. Children ran in packs through the crowd. A fiddle player stood on the steps of the mercantile and played something fast and sweet that made your feet want to move even when you were carrying a pie. Eudora registered her entry at the contest table, run by Martha Hollies, the minister's wife, who was efficient and cheerful, and wrote Eudora's name in the ledger with a small nod of acknowledgement that was not quite warmth but was not unkindness either. "Entry number 14, Martha said. "Set it on the table with the number card." The contest table was long and white-draped and already occupied by 13 other pies and cakes and cobblers, each one representing the considerable effort and the quiet competitive pride of the women who had made them. Eudora set her pie down between a lemon cream cake and a dried cherry cobbler, straightened the cloth, and stepped back. "It looks the prettiest," Clara announced at full volume, causing several women nearby to turn and look. "Hush," Eudora said, but she was almost smiling. The judging was not scheduled until 2 in the afternoon, which meant there were several hours of festival to get through. Eudora bought Thomas and Clara each a piece of hard candy from the confectioner's stall, a luxury she calculated she could afford from her 43 cents without compromising the remainder she needed for flour on Monday. She watched the fiddle player and let Clara drag her toward the ribbons and handwork display, and she tried not to keep looking at the contest table, where her pie sat among its competitors, waiting. It was during the second hour, when Eudora had found a spot in the shade of the post office awning and was watching Thomas play with the Granger boys in the street, that she first noticed Nelson Barnett. He was not a man who went unnoticed, though he seemed to want to be. He was tall and lean, with the kind of build that came from years of outdoor labor, broad through the shoulders and narrow at the hip, with dark brown hair that wanted to curl at the edges and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green that Eudora would later think of as the color of sage in early morning. He was dressed plainly, in a work shirt and canvas trousers and boots that had seen considerable use, and he wore his hat pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he had put it there to get it out of the way and not given it further thought. He was standing at the edge of the contest table with a tin cup of coffee in one hand, looking at the pies with the expression of a man who had been handed a problem he found genuinely interesting. Eudora would not have thought twice about him, except that at that moment Judge Calloway, one of the 3 official contest judges, walked past the table, stopped beside the tall man, and said something that made both of them laugh. Then the judge patted the man on the shoulder and walked away, and the tall man turned back to the pies with a thoughtful look. Eudora watched him for no particular reason she could have named. He picked up the card in front of the lemon cream cake and read it. He set it down. He moved along the table, reading the cards, and when he reached her pie, entry number 14, he stopped. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he did something that made Eudora's eyes go wide. He lifted the cloth she had folded back at the edge, leaned in slightly, and inhaled. She was across the street. She could not have heard anything from that distance over the noise of the festival. But she would have sworn later that she saw his expression change. He set the card down. He walked away from the table. Eudora exhaled and told herself she was being foolish for watching strangers at the pie table when she should be watching her children. She found out his name an hour later from Bessie Granger, who was one of those women who knew everything about everyone in a county of 3,000 people and was not shy about sharing it. "That's Nelson Barnett," Bessie said, without Eudora having asked because Bessie had caught her looking. "Came to Millhaven about 8 months ago. Bought the old Harcastle spread north of town. He's a rancher, runs cattle. Decent man from what I've heard, keeps to himself mostly. Not married." This last piece of information was delivered with the particular emphasis that small-town women use when they are making a point without quite saying it. "I wasn't asking," Eudora said pleasantly. "No," Bessie agreed, "but I thought you might want to know." The afternoon wore on. Thomas came back flushed and happy from playing in the street, and Clara fell asleep against Eudora's side on the bench where they had settled to wait. The fiddle player switched to something slower, and a couple began to dance in the cleared space in front of the mercantile. Eudora watched them and felt the familiar complicated feeling that came when she saw something she had once had and no longer did, that particular mingling of grief and gratitude, and something else she didn't have a good name for, something that might have been longing if she let it. She didn't let it. At 1:45, the crowd began to drift toward the contest table in anticipation of the judging. Eudora lifted Clara, who woke up grumbling and then settled against her shoulder, and walked back to where Thomas was waiting near the edge of the gathering. The judges were Millhaven's mayor, Gerald Coombs, who was a round man of 50 with magnificent whiskers, Mrs. Eugenia Taft, who had judged the baking contest for 11 consecutive years and was widely considered the foremost culinary authority in the county, and the third judge, whose identity Eudora now learned was a source of some local discussion. "He's a guest judge," she heard someone say nearby. "Coombs invited him special. Apparently he's got some background in it." "In baking," someone else said skeptically. "In food is what I heard. Spent some years in San Francisco before he came out here. Worked in a hotel kitchen or something of the kind." Eudora turned slightly to see who they were talking about, and then stood very still. Nelson Barnett was walking toward the judge's table. He caught her eye as he passed, or rather, he almost caught her eye, because at the last moment Eudora looked away, down at Clara's sleeping face against her shoulder, and when she looked up again he was taking his place beside Mayor Coombs with a calm, unhurried manner that suggested he was neither nervous about the responsibility nor particularly impressed by the ceremony of it. The judging began. It proceeded systematically, Mayor Coombs making small noises of appreciation at each entry, Mrs. Taft making precise and informed observations in a low voice, Nelson Barnett tasting each one thoughtfully and saying very little. They moved down the table from left to right. Eudora watched from 10 feet away, holding Clara and gripping the strap of her basket with her free hand. They reached entry number 14. Mrs. Taft cut a small slice with practiced efficiency. Mayor Coombs received his portion and forked a bite into his mouth and made the same appreciative noise he had made at 11 of the previous 13 entries. Mrs. Taft tasted hers, and something happened in her expression that was different from the polite approval she had shown the others. Her chin lifted slightly. She took a second small bite without speaking. Nelson Barnett picked up his fork. He put the first bite of Eudora's pie in his mouth, and he stopped. The stopping was subtle, not the theatrical kind but the genuine kind, the kind that happens when something bypasses all the social mechanics of a person and gets straight to something real. He set his fork down on the plate. He looked at the slice of pie. He picked up his fork again and took another bite more slowly. Eudora was watching so intently that she almost didn't notice when Thomas appeared at her elbow. "Are they at yours yet, Mama?" he whispered. "Yes," she said quietly. Mayor Coombs was already moving to lean toward the next entry, but Nelson Barnett was still looking at his plate. He said something to the mayor in a low voice. The mayor turned back. "Mrs. Taft made a note in her small ledger. The judges conferred briefly, moved to the remaining entry at the end of the table, tasted it, conferred again, and then retired to the side of the stage area where Mayor Coombs would announce the results. Eudora breathed. In the 5 minutes that followed, while the crowd waited and the fiddle player stopped playing, and the afternoon light shifted golden over the bunting and the faces of the townspeople, Eudora became aware that Nelson Barnett had stepped away from the judge's table and was moving through the crowd in a general direction that was difficult to read until it became quite clear that he was moving toward her. She almost turned away. She had a strong instinct to turn away, which she recognized as the instinct to avoid things that felt too important when you were already carrying as much as you could manage. But Clara had woken up and was asking for water, and by the time Eudora had sorted out the water situation from the small canteen in the basket, there was no turning away to be done because Nelson Barnett was standing 2 feet from her. He was close enough now that she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes and the particular quality of his attention, which was very direct and very quiet at the same time. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. He had a low, level voice with a slight Western drawl, not heavy but present. "You're not," Eudora said because it was true. She adjusted Clara on her hip. "I wanted to say something about the pie," he said. He stopped. He seemed to be choosing his words with unusual care, like a man who knew that words mattered and did not want to waste them. "I've eaten a great deal of food in my life, more than most. I spent 3 years working in the kitchens at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, and before that I grew up on a ranch where my mother cooked every day of her life and made it look like nothing. I've tasted skill before." He paused again. "What was in that pie is not just skill. That's something passed down, that's something that belongs to somebody." Eudora stared at him. "I beg your pardon," she said. "The flavor," he said, "the spice balance, the way the custard set. Someone taught you that specifically. It's not something a person figures out alone." She was quiet for a moment because she hadn't expected to be seen quite that clearly by a stranger at a pie table. "My grandmother," she said. "She came from Virginia." He nodded as if this confirmed something. "I thought it had the East in it." He glanced down at Thomas, who had been studying him with the direct, evaluating gaze of a 7-year-old. "Your son, Thomas," Eudora said, "and this is Clara, Mrs. Hayes," he said, and she realized he must have looked at the entry card. "I'm Nelson Barnett. I have a ranch north of town." "I know," she said. "Bessie Granger told me." Something moved across his face that might have been amusement. "I imagine she did," he said. Before either of them could say anything further, Mayor Coombs mounted the wooden platform that had been set up in front of the mercantile and called for attention, and the crowd shifted and tightened around the stage. Eudora turned toward the sound with her heart beating in a way she could feel in her throat. The mayor went through the ceremony of it with evident pleasure, thanking the participants and praising the quality of the entries and congratulating the committee and the judges. And Eudora stood very still through all of it with Clara on her hip and Thomas pressed against her side. And she thought about $50 and new boot soles and flour enough for winter. And she tried not to want it too much, because wanting things too much had a way of making their absence more cruel. "And the first prize of $50, Mayor Coombs announced, holding an envelope in one hand with theatrical pleasure, "goes to entry number 14. Mrs. Eudora Hayes." The crowd applauded. Clara clapped her hands without entirely understanding why. Thomas let out a sound that was half shout, half sob, and pressed his face into Eudora's side, and she put her free hand on the back of his head and held him there for a moment while the applause continued around them, and she allowed herself, just for that moment, to close her eyes. When she opened them, Nelson Barnett was looking at her from 2 feet away with an expression that was quiet and warm and entirely without performance. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hayes," he said. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady, which she was proud of. She went up to collect the envelope with both children beside her, shook the mayor's hand, thanked Mrs. Taft and the committee, and came back down the steps into the crowd with $50 in her hand and something in her chest that felt dangerously close to joy. The rest of the afternoon passed in a kind of warm blur. Several women came to congratulate her, some with genuine warmth and some with the particular bright-eyed cordiality that is the polite face of disappointment. Martha Hollies, who had entered a perfectly lovely pecan cake, was among the warmest, and Eudora was grateful for it. She bought Thomas and Clara each a proper piece of pie from the refreshments table, an apple one, and sat with them on the bench while the fiddle started up again and the light went amber over the street. She was aware, in the peripheral and involuntary way of a person trying not to be aware of something, that Nelson Barnett had not left the festival. She saw him twice through the afternoon. Once talking to a man she didn't know near the livery stable, looking at a horse with that same focused, evaluating manner he had brought to the pie table. Once standing alone at the edge of the crowd where the fiddle music carried, with his coffee cup and his hat pushed back, and his face turned slightly toward the music. She did not go and speak to him again, because she was practical and she had her children, and she had $50 to get home safely, and she had no business standing around at festivals mooning over men she had just met at pie tables, even men with gray-green eyes and the kind of attention that made you feel seen in a way you hadn't expected. She gathered the children when the afternoon began to cool, picked up her empty basket from the contest table, and started the walk home along the road out of town. They were perhaps a quarter-mile out when she heard hoofbeats on the road behind them. She moved to the side with the children, which was the sensible thing to do, and the rider slowed as he came alongside them. It was Nelson Barnett on a dark bay horse that moved well under him, the way a horse moves for a rider it trusts. "I'm heading north," he said, reining in. "It's a long walk with 2 children." Eudora looked at him. Then she looked at Thomas, who had been flagging since the 2nd mile without complaint. Then she looked at Clara, who was doing the peculiar walking sleep that very young children do when they are exhausted and determined not to say so. "We're fine," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I wasn't suggesting otherwise." He looked ahead down the road. "The Harcastle spread is north. I pass your lane on the way." She considered this for a moment, the road, the failing light, Clara's stumbling steps. "Clara can ride," she said finally, "if you'll lead the horse." "Yes, ma'am," he said. He dismounted in one easy motion and lifted Clara, who was too tired to object, onto the saddle with a matter-of-fact gentleness that made something tighten briefly in Eudora's throat. He took the horse's bridle and they walked, the 4 of them, along the road north of Millhaven in the golden pink of early evening, with the smell of sage coming off the hills and the first star appearing in the pale sky overhead. Thomas, after a long evaluating silence, asked Nelson what kind of horse it was. "Bay gelding," Nelson said. "Quarter horse mostly, with some Morgan in him. His name's Doyle." "Why Doyle?" Thomas asked. "He came with it," Nelson said. "Didn't seem right to change it." Thomas considered this with great seriousness. "I think that's fair," he said. Eudora walked beside them and said nothing, which was not because she had nothing to say, but because the moment felt fragile in a way she did not want to disturb, like a reflection in still water. When they reached the lane that led down to her house, Nelson lifted a deeply asleep Clara down from the saddle without waking her and handed her to Eudora, who settled the child against her shoulder. "Thank you," Eudora said, "for the pie, for what you said about it." He looked at her in the fading light. "What I said was the truth." "I know," she said. "That's why I was thanking you." He seemed to think about that. "Good night, Mrs. Hayes. Good night, Mr. Barnett." She carried Clara down the lane with Thomas beside her and the basket over her arm and $50 in her pocket, and she did not look back because she was practical, and because she was quite sure that if she looked back she would find him still standing there in the road, and she didn't know what to do with that information. She put the children to bed and sat at the kitchen table with the lamp on and the money spread out before her and made her list. Flour, salt, lard, coal for the stove. New soles for Thomas's boots. A small payment to Mr. Finch. A piece of good wool for Clara's coat, because the one from last winter was too small and showing wear in the elbows. She added it all up twice and found that she had done it, just barely done it, and she sat for a moment with the list in her hands and permitted herself to feel something simple and clean. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere on the hill and then was quiet. She went to bed. The following week passed in the rhythm of ordinary winter preparation, which in Wyoming in 1882 was a serious business. Eudora made her purchases carefully, mended what needed mending, put up the last of the summer's preserves that she had been storing in the root cellar, and taught Thomas his letters at the kitchen table in the evenings, while Clara drew incomprehensible pictures on the backs of old letters. She paid Mr. Finch 3 weeks of back rent, which he accepted with the stiff dignity of a man who was not entirely without conscience, but had found a way to insulate himself from the full application of it. She had the soles put on Thomas's boots at the cobbler's shop and carried them home wrapped in newspaper. She did not think about Nelson Barnett. She thought about him approximately 3 times a day, which she considered an improvement over the first 2 days after the festival, when it had been considerably more. She thought about the way he had looked at her pie before he tasted it. She thought about what he had said afterward, the thing about what was passed down and what belonged to somebody. She thought about the walk along the road in the evening light, and his hand on Clara's back as he lifted her to the saddle. She told herself firmly that widows with 2 children and a debt to Mr. Finch and a cracked ceramic mixing bowl did not have the luxury of entertaining such thoughts, and then she thought the thoughts anyway, which was humbling. On Thursday of that week, she was at the general store when she encountered Martha Hollis, who was buying thread and looking pleased about something. "I heard Nelson Barnett asked after you," Martha said, with the particular combination of information and innocence that small-town people perfect over years of practice. Eudora set down the salt. "I beg your pardon. He came in on Tuesday for supplies and asked Tom Reedy how you were getting on," Martha said. "Tom told me." She wound her thread carefully and did not look up. "He's a good man from what I can gather, keeps his word, pays what he owes. His ranch is coming along nicely for its first year." "Martha," Eudora said. "I'm just saying," Martha said. "I know what you're just saying," Eudora said, and paid for her salt. She thought about it the whole walk home. He came on Saturday. She was in the yard hanging washing, which was cold work in October but necessary, when she heard the horse on the lane, and turned to find Nelson Barnett riding Doyle in a slow, unhurried manner that suggested he was not sure of his welcome and was keeping his options open. She waited, because it was her yard and there was nowhere else to go, and because some part of her had been expecting this even while another part of her had been hoping she was wrong. He stopped at the gate and took his hat off, which she thought was a nice gesture for a man on horseback. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I hope I'm not intruding." "You're not," she said, because again it was true. He dismounted and tied Doyle to the fence post with the ease of long practice. He came to the gate and stopped there, which she appreciated, because he was asking in the physical language of the thing whether he could come in, and she could say no without it being anything more than what it was. "Come through," she said. "I'll put some coffee on." It was the beginning of something that neither of them named for a while, because naming things made them real in ways you couldn't take back, and both of them had learned to be careful with what couldn't be taken back. He sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee while Clara immediately began showing him her drawings, which were a collection of circles and lines that she explained were horses and mountains, and on one occasion a very abstract rendering of the general store. "That one's you," Clara said, pointing at a tall oblong shape. "Is it?" he said with great seriousness. "You're very tall," Clara said. Thomas came in from the small woodpile where he had been chopping kindling, which he took seriously as his contribution to the household, and stopped in the doorway when he saw Nelson. "Hello," Thomas said. "Hello," Nelson said. "Good stack of kindling out there." Thomas straightened almost imperceptibly. "I do it every week," he said. They talked about the ranch, which was called the Double Bar B and ran 300 head currently, with plans to expand in the spring. He talked about it without false modesty and without excessive pride, just clearly, the way a man talks about something he cares about and respects. She told him about the house, about the root cellar she needed to repair before winter, about the window in the back room that had been letting cold air in since August, and that she had been patching with rags because she hadn't had money for the glass before now. He asked if he could look at the window. She said he could. He looked at it for 5 minutes with his head bent and his long fingers pressing the frame, and then he said that the frame was rotted through on one side and that patching it would do for now, but in the spring it would need to be replaced. "I know," she said. "I can fix it properly," he said. "Not today, but when the weather breaks." She looked at him. "Mr. Barnett, I can't pay you for that." "I wasn't asking you to," he said. "Your prize-winning pie fed 3 judges and about 40 festival goers, and the people who made it deserve better than a rotten window frame." "That's not a sound argument," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." He looked at the window. "I'd like to help if you'll let me, without it meaning anything you're not comfortable with it meaning." Eudora stood in the doorway of the back room and looked at this man who had appeared at her pie table 6 days ago with gray-green eyes and more honesty than she had expected from anyone, and she made the careful, considered decision of a practical woman who was also, underneath the practicality, a person with a heart that had not stopped working despite everything. "All right," she said. "But I'll feed you when you come because that's what I can offer." "That seems fair," he said. He came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and by the 3rd Saturday it had become a thing that Thomas expected and Clara demanded, and Eudora found herself preparing for with a combination of efficient practicality and a fuss over the quality of the coffee that she refused to examine too closely. He fixed the back fence that had been leaning since spring. He split a cord of wood that Eudora could not have managed alone before winter truly set in. He brought a piece of glass for the window from town and installed it with patient precision, showing Thomas how the putty worked and why you pressed it at the angle you did, and Thomas watched with the intense concentration of a boy who was learning something he would use for the rest of his life. In return, Eudora fed him. She fed him the way her grandmother had taught her, with the particular care and attention that goes into food when it is made for someone you want to feed well. And every Saturday, she found herself thinking a little more carefully about what he might like. And every Saturday he ate with the same genuine, specific appreciation that he had brought to her contest pie, saying not just that it was good, but naming what made it good. The way she had salted the potatoes before roasting them. The way the bread crust had the right amount of crack to it. The way the beans had been started with fat and onion before the water went in. She had never been thanked for food in quite that way before. Robert had been a good man and he had eaten everything she put in front of him and been grateful for it, but his gratitude was general, the gratitude of a man glad to have a good meal. Nelson Barnett's attention was specific, and specificity, she was discovering, was its own kind of intimacy. By November they were talking, really talking, in the way that takes time to arrive at and cannot be rushed. He told her about San Francisco, about the hotel kitchen where he had spent 3 years learning things about food and flavor that he had never expected to learn, about the variety of people who had passed through that kitchen and what they had taught him, about the moment he had realized that a city was not where he belonged, that he had been born for open land and the particular freedom and difficulty of the Western Range. She told him about Virginia, about her grandmother's kitchen, about the years she had spent learning to bake before she understood that she was learning something worth knowing. She told him about Robert, carefully and with affection, because Robert deserved to be spoken of with affection, and because she needed to know that Nelson could hear it without discomfort. He listened. He asked questions that showed he had heard. He did not say the things people usually said. "He sounds like a good man," Nelson said one evening in November, when they were sitting by the fire after the children had gone to bed, each with a cup of coffee, the lamp burning low on the table. "He was," Eudora said. "He wasn't always easy to live with because nobody is, but he was good and he loved us." "That's not a small thing," Nelson said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." There was a comfortable silence. The fire shifted and settled. Outside, the first real snow of the season was beginning, coming down in the quiet, deliberate way of Wyoming snow, like a decision being made. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Why did you come to Millhaven, specifically? There are ranching opportunities in other places." He looked at the fire for a moment. "I had been in San Francisco for 3 years, and before that moving around the territory for another 2, working cattle, working odd jobs. And there came a point where I realized I had been moving for a long time and I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I needed land. Something that was mine, that I was responsible for and answerable to." He paused. "My brother has a place east of Cheyenne." He mentioned Millhaven. "The Hardcastle spread came up for sale at a price I could manage, so I came." "And," she said, he looked at her then. "And it turned out to be the right place," he said, "for a number of reasons." She looked back at him, and the fire made the shadows in the room move gently, and she knew that they were at the edge of something, and that the next thing said would tip them one way or the other. She said, "I'm glad you came." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So am I, Eudora." It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it land somewhere in the middle of her chest. They sat by the fire for another hour, talking about less weighty things: the winter that was coming, Thomas's progress with his letters, Clara's latest artistic interpretation of the world. And the fire burned down and the snow fell outside, and neither of them seemed to be in any particular hurry to let the evening end. When he put on his coat and hat and went out to his horse, and when she stood in the doorway wrapped in her shawl watching him go, the snow swirling soft and silver in the dark, she thought, "This is how it happens." Not in a flash, not in a moment, but in accumulated Saturdays, in coffee cups and window frames and the names of horses, in the way a person hears your food and sees your grief and says your name like it means something. December brought the deep cold and the short days and the particular beautiful austerity of a Wyoming winter. Nelson came every week without fail, which required some determination when the snow was heavy on the North Road, and Eudora found herself watching for Doyle's shape in the white distance from the kitchen window with a regularity that made her shake her head at herself. He brought things when he came, firewood when she was running low, a bag of oats that he claimed were spare from the ranch stores, a book he had been through and thought Thomas might like, a length of good red wool that arrived wrapped in paper one Saturday in early December with only the note, "For Clara's coat, as I understand there was need of one." She had stood in the kitchen with the wool in her hands and the note on the table and worked very hard at not crying, which she managed, though it was a near thing. She made the coat that week, working in the evenings after the children were in bed, cutting and stitching by lamplight until her eyes ached, and when Clara tried it on she twirled in the middle of the kitchen floor and said it was the reddest coat in all of Wyoming, which was probably accurate. "Mr. Barnett got the wool," Thomas said, with the directness of a child who has been watching something unfold and drawn his own conclusions. "He did," Eudora said. "I like him," Thomas said in the tone of a boy delivering a considered verdict. "I'm glad," Eudora said carefully. Thomas looked at her with those serious eyes. "Do you like him, Mama?" Eudora threaded her needle with great concentration. "Yes," she said, "I do." Thomas nodded, satisfied, and went back to his book. It was on a Saturday in mid-December, with a blue sky overhead and snow bright on the ground, and the ranch work temporarily caught up enough that Nelson had come early and stayed through lunch, and they had spent the afternoon at the kitchen table playing a card game with Thomas that Clara kept trying to cheat at. When things shifted in the way that they do when they have been building for a while, and finally arrive somewhere. The children were in the back room, Thomas reading, Clara ostensibly resting, but in practice conducting a quiet conversation with her collection of carved wooden animals. Nelson was helping Eudora put the lunch things away, the easy, comfortable division of a task by two people who have been doing things together long enough to know each other's rhythms. She was reaching for the high shelf to put the good serving dish away, the one that came out for company, and he reached past her for it at the same moment. And they stopped, both of them, closer than they usually stood, close enough that she could see the thread in his collar and smell the wool and cold air and wood smoke of him. She did not step back, he didn't either. He said very quietly, "Eudora." And she said, "Yes," which was not an answer to anything he had asked but was somehow the right response. He put his hand against her cheek, slow and careful, asking, and she didn't move away, and he lowered his head and kissed her with the same focused, genuine attention he brought to everything. And it was neither hurried nor hesitant but something else entirely, something that felt like arriving somewhere after a long journey. She put her hand against his chest and kissed him back. When they separated, both of them stood quietly for a moment, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of lunch and coffee and the wood stove, and outside the Wyoming winter was doing its beautiful austere thing with the light on the snow. "I meant to do that with more ceremony," he said. "I liked it this way," she said. He looked at her. "I want to be clear about what I mean," he said. "I'm not a man who does things part way. I'm not going to come on Saturdays and kiss you in the kitchen and leave it as something comfortable and indefinite. If you'll permit me to court you properly, I will, and I'd like to know if that's welcome." She looked at him for a long moment. The practical part of her, the part that had been running the household and holding everything together for 2 years, ran through its concerns quickly. The children, what they would make of it, what the town would say, whether she was ready, whether she was being foolish, whether he was what he seemed. Then the part of her that was not only practical, the part that had watched him lift her sleeping daughter onto a horse with 2 hands full of gentleness, that had heard him name what was in her pie as something passed down and belonging to somebody, that had sat with him by the fire in November while the snow started and felt something she had thought she was done feeling, that part said, "Yes. It's welcome," she said. "Very much so." He smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile with his whole face, not the small controlled version he usually offered, and it changed him completely, made him look younger and more open and startlingly handsome. "Good," he said. And then, more quietly, "Good." He stayed for supper, and afterward he sat with the children while Eudora washed up, and she could hear Thomas asking him questions about cattle breeding with the seriousness of a boy who was deciding whether someone deserved his full investment, and she could hear Nelson answering with the same seriousness. And Clara, who had no interest in cattle breeding, periodically offering factual statements about her wooden animals that Nelson received with unfailing gravity. When he left that night, he held her hand at the door for a moment, which was the whole of it, and it was enough. January was cold as iron, as January in Wyoming always is, and the courting was conducted in the way that the circumstances required, with practicality and warmth, and the children almost always present, and the town of Millhaven watching with the avid interest of a community that has very few diversions in deep winter. Bessie Granger told Eudora in January that at least 3 people had mentioned seeing Nelson's horse outside the Hayes house on Saturdays, and that opinion in town was favorable, which Eudora received with equanimity, because she had long since made her peace with the fact that small towns have opinions, and that peace with this fact is the only rational response to it. He came in January and he came in February, through snow that would stop ordinary social movement, through cold that required a kind of physical stubbornness to manage. He always came. She came to understand that this was a thing about him, that when he committed to something he committed absolutely, and that his version of caring for someone was expressed primarily in showing up, in being present and reliable and steady, which was, she thought, the form of love that mattered most in the long run. In February, he brought her snowdrops that he had found somehow on a south-facing slope where the snow had thinned enough for them, wrapped in a piece of cloth to keep them from freezing on the ride, and handed them to her at the door with the directness of a man who is not embarrassed by tenderness. She put them in a cup of water on the kitchen table, and they lasted 3 days, white and small and impossible. And every time she looked at them, she thought about the slope he must have ridden to, and the care it had taken to bring them home without letting them freeze. March brought the first hints of thaw and a change in the light, the lengthening of days that means something particular in Wyoming, a kind of physical promise after months of cold. Nelson came on the first Saturday in March with a proposal to take the children to see the new calves at the Double Bar Bee, and Eudora bundled them into their coats, Clara in the famous red one, and they made the ride north to the ranch in the wagon he had borrowed for the occasion. The Double Bar Bee was a working ranch in a no-nonsense way. The house and barn plainly built and kept with the same straightforward efficiency that Nelson brought to everything. But there was something in the proportions of it, in the way it sat against the hill, that had a kind of rightness to it that Eudora felt without being able to articulate. The calves were everything a child could wish, small and wobbling and enormous-eyed, and Clara immediately attempted to put her arms around one, which the calf received with dignified alarm. Thomas stood at the fence and watched with the expression of a boy who was working very hard at not being as delighted as he was. "Can we come back?" Clara demanded. "Yes," Nelson said. "Often," Clara specified. "As often as you like," he said. Clara looked at Eudora with the purposeful expression of a 5-year-old who has made a tactical decision. "Mama," she said, "we should move here." There was a silence. Nelson's eyes met Eudora's over Clara's head, and the expression in them was a question he had not yet asked in words, and Eudora felt her heart do something complicated and warm. "I think," Eudora said carefully, "that's a conversation for another time." "Why another time?" Clara demanded. "Because the calf is trying to eat your sleeve," Nelson said, which successfully redirected Clara's attention, and the moment passed, or rather it was set aside where both of them knew it was waiting. He asked her properly in April, when the thaw was complete and the land had that washed, new quality that early spring brings to the West. He did not ask her in the kitchen or at the gate or on horseback on the road. He asked her in the garden she had been trying to coax into life behind the house, where she had been turning the soil with a spade while the afternoon light went warm and the sage on the hills sent its sharp, clean smell into the air. He came and helped her with the spade because that was his nature, and when the row was turned he leaned on the handle and looked at her, and she looked back. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I know," she said. "Will you marry me?" He said, "You and Thomas and Clara. I want to ask all 3 of you, because it's all 3 of you I'm asking to take on." She had known it was coming. She had been knowing it was coming since February if she was honest, since November if she was very honest. But knowing does not always prepare you for the real moment of it, for the feeling of standing in your kitchen garden in April with a man who has spent 6 months showing up and paying attention and being exactly what he appeared to be, asking you to share his life. "I would like that very much," she said. "Yes." He crossed the garden and took her hands and kissed her with the same careful, wholehearted attention as the first time, and the smell of sage and turned earth was everywhere, and a meadowlark was singing somewhere on the hill, and she thought, "This is real. This happened. I am here in this moment, and it is real." "I want you to know," he said, when they had separated and she had her forehead against his shoulder for a moment, "that whatever you bring to this and whatever I bring to it, we'll make something of it. Together, I'm not coming into this thinking I know how it goes. I'm coming in thinking you're the most capable and remarkable woman I've ever met, and that together we'll figure out what we're building." She lifted her head. "That's a good way to approach it," she said. "I thought about it for a while," he said. "I know you did," she said. they told the children that evening. Thomas received the information with great seriousness, asking several practical questions about horses and the ranch, and whether he could have a dog, which Nelson answered with the specific, respectful attention of a man who understood that serious questions deserved serious answers. Clara screamed with a volume that was startling in a 5-year-old and immediately asked if she could wear her red coat to the wedding, which Eudora said yes to while Nelson stood in the kitchen looking slightly overwhelmed in the best possible way. They were married in June, in the small white church on Millhaven's Main Street, on a clear, bright day with the mountains visible on the horizon, and the town turned out in the way small towns turn out for things they have been watching develop all winter with considerable interest. Martha Hollis cried, which she would later attribute to allergies. Bessie Granger looked satisfied in the way of a woman who has been right about something and is trying not to say so. Thomas stood beside Nelson during the ceremony with his spine very straight and his face very serious, and Clara stood beside Eudora in the red coat, which was slightly too warm for June, but this had been non-negotiable, and the minister spoke the words, and they said the words back to him, and it was done. The wedding dinner was at the Double Barbie, which was now their home, and Eudora had cooked most of it herself over the previous 2 days, which several people told her was unorthodox for a bride to do, but which she had done anyway because she wanted the food to be right. Nelson had helped her, without being asked, and without making it anything other than the simple pleasure of cooking alongside someone you love, and together they had made enough food for 40 people, which was approximately how many people arrived. Bessie Granger ate 3 helpings of the apple custard pie that Eudora made for the dessert and said, clearly and to no one in particular, that it was the best thing she had ever eaten. "That's the one that started all of this," she added. "I know it is," Nelson said, and looked at Eudora with the expression she was coming to think of as particularly his, warm and specific and entirely without performance. The summer was a good one. Eudora settled into the ranch with the practical thoroughness that was her nature, learning the rhythms of the place, the cattle and the land, and the particular demands of a working ranch household, which were different from but not entirely unlike the demands of the little house in town. She brought her grandmother's recipes and her cracked ceramic bowl and the worn rolling pin and the high shelf's careful treasures, and she found places for them in the Double Barbie kitchen that soon smelled, to Nelson's deep satisfaction, of the things she made in it. Thomas took to ranch life with a seriousness that Nelson responded to by teaching him, systematically and without condescension, everything he knew. He taught him to ride, which Thomas already knew a little, but properly this time, with attention to the horse's responses. He taught him to read the land for weather. He taught him the mathematics of cattle ranching, how you calculated carrying capacity and managed grazing rotations, and thought about the winter feed requirements in August so that you were not undone in February. Thomas absorbed all of it with the focused hunger of a boy who had been waiting for someone to teach him things that mattered. Clara attached herself to the ranch horses with a devotion that alarmed Eudora slightly, but that Nelson encouraged, with the observation that a girl who grew up comfortable with horses in Wyoming would have a significant practical advantage in life. He lifted her onto the gentlest of the ranch horses, a steady old mare named Pearl, and walked her around the corral every evening that summer until Clara was guiding the horse herself with small, confident hands on the reins. Eudora watched this from the fence and felt something that did not have a precise name, but that filled up the space under her ribs in a warm and complete way. In August, she told Nelson that she was expecting their child. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening quietly, the children already in bed, the lamp burning low. He went very still in the way he went still when something mattered greatly, and then he put his arms around her and held her without speaking for a long moment. "Are you well?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Very well." "Good," he said. He kissed her temple. "Good." He was careful with her through the autumn without being suffocating about it, which was the right approach, because Eudora Hayes did not respond well to being treated as if she were made of paper. He took on more of the heavy work without comment. He made sure there was enough wood split and enough water brought. He did these things so naturally and quietly that it was nearly impossible to make a fuss about them, which she suspected was intentional. The harvest festival came around again in October, and Millhaven put up its bunting and its fiddle player and its contest table, and Eudora, who was not going to enter the baking contest this year because she had other things to think about but who was also, fundamentally, a woman who liked to win, entered the baking contest. She made the same pie. Brown sugar and apple custard with the cinnamon and ginger, and the rose hip powder from the small jar that she kept carefully stocked, her grandmother's recipe, her grandmother's secret, the pie that had started all of it. This year she was not carrying it alone. Nelson walked beside her into town, and Thomas carried the basket, and Clara rode Pearl for the first portion of the journey and then walked when the streets of town became too busy for a small girl on a horse to manage comfortably. She set her entry on the contest table, entry number 7 this year, and she stood with Nelson's hand at her back, steady and warm, while the festival moved around them. When the judging began, Nelson was not a judge this year, having recused himself on the entirely reasonable grounds that his wife was competing, and the panel of 3 proceeded without him. He stood with Eudora in the crowd and watched with his arms folded and his hat pushed back and an expression that was trying to be neutral and not entirely managing it. "You know you're going to win," he said quietly. "I don't know that," she said. "I know that," he said. "I ate every entry at this contest last year as a judge, and I am telling you with complete objectivity that there is nothing on that table that approaches what you make." "You are not objective," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I am also not wrong." She won. The prize this year was the same $50, which she received with considerably more composure than the previous year, though no less feeling. The applause from the crowd was warm and extended, with the particular warmth that Millhaven had developed for the Barnetts over the course of a year and a half, the quiet approval of a community that liked what it saw. Clara, from her position at Eudora's knee, announced to nobody in particular and everybody within range that her mother was the best baker in Wyoming, which provoked considerable amusement. "All of Wyoming," someone called. "All of it," Clara confirmed, untroubled. They walked home in the October dusk, or rather Nelson drove them home in the wagon, because Eudora was 7 months along and the walking would have been too much. And the money sat in Eudora's pocket and the children sat in the back of the wagon with the empty basket, and Thomas fell asleep against Clara's shoulder as the stars came out one by one above the dark hills. Nelson drove with one hand on the reins and one hand finding hers on the seat between them, and the wagon moved at an easy pace along the north road, and Eudora leaned her head against his shoulder and watched the stars multiply overhead. "What will you do with it?" he said. "The prize money." "Yes," she thought about it. "Put it away," she said, "for when it's needed." He nodded. "Good thinking." "That's what I did last year," she said, "and look how that turned out." He turned his head to look at her and she felt his smile before she saw it, the warmth of it in the dark. "Best investment the county ever made," he said. "The contest prize." "The contest," he said. "The pie, all of it." He pressed her hand. "All of it, Eudora." She closed her eyes for a moment and listened to the horses' hooves on the road and the children breathing in the back of the wagon and the enormous Wyoming night around them. "I used to be afraid," she said quietly, "after Robert died. Not of being alone exactly, but of not being enough, of not being able to hold it all together, of the 43 cents and the cracked bowl and the cold coming and the rent and all of it just being more than I could manage." "You managed it," he said. "I did," she said, "but I was afraid the whole time." "And now," he said. She thought about the kitchen at the Double Barbie and Thomas learning to read the land and Clara on Pearl and the warmth of him beside her and the child they would have in December, the new person arriving into the life they had built. "Now," she said, "I'm not afraid." He did not say anything to that. He didn't need to. He just held her hand as they drove home through the dark. Their son was born on the 7th of December, in the blue hour just before dawn, in the bedroom of the double bar B with the midwife, Mrs. Polly Kern, presiding and Nelson present because Eudora had been clear that she wanted him there, and he would not have been anywhere else on earth. He was a solid, vehement child who announced his arrival with a fury that made Nelson laugh with surprise and relief, and who, when placed in his father's arms for the first time, stopped crying and looked at him with enormous, searching eyes. "He looks like he has opinions already," Mrs. Kern observed. "He comes by that honestly," Nelson said, and looked at Eudora with something in his face that she did not have words for and did not need them. They named him Robert James Barnett, Robert for Eudora's late husband, because that name deserved to go forward into the world and Thomas had asked for it, and James for Nelson's father, who had died 2 years before Nelson came to Wyoming, and who had taught him the things about ranching and land, and what it meant to be responsible for something that had made him who he was. The two names sat well together. Thomas took his role as older brother with the same gravity he brought to everything, appointing himself immediately responsible for Robert's welfare in any situation that Thomas judged to require intervention, which was several times a day. Clara held the baby with an intensity that suggested she had been waiting for this specific event her whole life, and informed him at length about her wooden animal collection, which she appeared to believe he would find relevant. The winter was easier than the winters before. Not easier in the physical sense, because Wyoming winters are not interested in anyone's circumstances, but easier in the way things are when you go through them with someone, when the weight is distributed between 2 pairs of hands and 2 minds and 2 hearts, and when the house you come in from the cold to is warm not only from the stove but from the people in it. In February, when Robert was 2 months old and slept in the cradle, Nelson had made during the autumn with a patience and skill that had surprised Eudora and probably should not have. Nelson came in from the barn one evening and sat down at the kitchen table with the look of a man who was working something through. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. She sat across from him, Robert asleep against her shoulder, the lamp on the table between them. "All right," she said. "I've been thinking about the ranch," he said, "about expansion. There's a section of land to the east of the current boundary that Callaway is looking to sell. Good grazing, good water access. It would let us run another 150 head in 2 years, maybe 200. She looked at him. "How much is he asking?" he told her. She did the arithmetic in her head, which she could do quickly, a skill she had developed out of necessity. "We could manage that," she said slowly. "If the spring calving goes well and if the prices hold from last autumn." "That's my calculation too," he said. He watched her. "But it's a risk. I want you to know all of it, not just the favorable parts." "Tell me the unfavorable parts," she said. He did. He laid out the full picture, the way any significant investment on a working ranch carried uncertainty, the way weather and cattle prices and illness in the herd were variables that could not be controlled, the way the expansion would mean harder work in the short term before it meant easier work in the longer term. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "I think we should do it." He looked at her. "You're certain?" "I think it's a sound plan, and I think you have thought it through more carefully than most people think through anything," she said. "And I think this ranch is going to be something real and lasting, and that's worth taking a considered risk for." He was quiet for a moment. "I value your judgment," he said. "You know that." "I know," she said, "and I value yours. That's how this works." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly how this works." Spring came and the calving went better than expected. The prices held, and Nelson bought the eastern section from Callaway in April on a handshake that Millhaven's notary then made proper and legal. The boundary of the double bar B moved east, and the larger herd that would fill the new grazing land was a project that would unfold over 2 years, but the foundation was laid. Thomas, who was 9 now and had been fully enrolled in all ranch decisions that could appropriately include a 9-year-old, took a proprietary interest in the eastern section, and spent considerable time walking it with a seriousness that made Nelson tell Eudora privately that the boy had a genuine instinct for land. "He's going to be a good rancher," Nelson said. "He's going to be a good man," Eudora said. "The ranching will come with it." Nelson looked at her. "Is there a difference?" "Usually not," she said. "In your case, definitely not." He smiled at her. The second Harvest Festival, which was the one that would mark 2 full years since Eudora had walked into Millhaven with her pie and her 43 cents and her careful desperation, arrived on a warm October Saturday with the mountains clear on the horizon and the leaves turned golden on the aspens along the creek. Eudora made the pie again because it was her pie and it was good and she liked winning, but also because by now the pie had become something else, a thread of continuity in the life she was building, a reminder of where things had started and what they had become. She brought Nelson and all 3 children, Robert in his arms, Clara on Pearl who had been judged safe and calm enough for the festival crowds, Thomas walking beside them with the long stride he had been unconsciously adopting from Nelson for 2 years. The festival was as it always was, loud and warm and smelling of roasted corn and cider and the particular dust of October. The fiddle player was back, a young man this year who played with more speed than the older fellow of the previous years, and the music spilled into the street with a brightness that made people want to move. Eudora set her entry on the table, entry number 3. She went with Nelson and the children through the festival, eating the corn that Thomas wanted, and the ribbon candy that Clara demanded, and the hot cider that Robert showed considerable interest in before being redirected. She talked to Martha Hollies and to Bessie Granger, and to several of the ranch families she had come to know over the past year, the Dawsons and the Garrittys and old Sam Pettiford who had been ranching in the county since before most current residents had arrived. She danced with Nelson when the fiddle struck up something appropriate, which was possible because Bessie had offered to walk Robert for a few minutes, and Thomas had appointed himself responsible for his sister, and they danced in the cleared space in front of the mercantile, the way they had watched other people dance 2 years ago when they were strangers, and it was neither elegant nor practiced, but it was joyful. And the townspeople around them smiled at them, with the warmth of people watching something they have had the pleasure of witnessing from the beginning. When the judging was announced, they stood together in the crowd, and Mayor Coombs went through his ceremony, and the result was the same as the year before, which was entry number 3, Mrs. Eudora Barnett. This time the applause was very warm, and Bessie Granger was loudest, and from somewhere in the back of the crowd someone let out a cowboy yell that made Clara jump and then laugh. Eudora collected the envelope with $50 in it and shook hands and thanked the committee, and when she came back down the steps, Nelson was waiting at the bottom and he swept her into a brief, unpretentious kiss that made Martha Hollies press her handkerchief to her mouth and murmur something about what a fine thing it was. "3 times you've entered," Thomas said when they were gathering to leave. He was doing the arithmetic. "Twice," Eudora said. "I didn't enter the first year." "The first year you were just trying to keep us alive," Thomas said with the specific terrible honesty of a 9-year-old. A silence. "Yes," Eudora said, "I was." "And now we're fine," Thomas said. "Yes," she said. "Now we're fine." Thomas nodded. "Good," he said, and then turned to help Clara negotiate the transition from Pearl's back to the ground with the focused care of a big brother doing his job. Eudora looked at Nelson, who was watching Thomas with the expression she had come to associate with moments of particular feeling in him, quiet and clear and warm. "Yes," she said again, for no reason she could explain or for every reason which amounted to the same thing. The years that followed were good years in the way that years can be good when the foundation under them is sound. Not easy, because nothing in Wyoming was easy, and ranching was hard work and the winters were still cold, And there were seasons when the cattle prices dropped, and seasons when the weather did damage, and seasons when the unexpected arrived and required everything you had. But good, in the deep sense, in the sense of lives being built and people growing and things mattering. Robert grew from an opinionated infant into an opinionated toddler, and then into an opinionated small boy who was fearless in the specific way that youngest children of confident households often are, entirely certain that the world was basically well disposed toward him, and that most problems could be approached directly. He had Nelson's coloring and Eudora's particular way of reading a situation, and he attached himself to the ranch horses at approximately the same age Clara had, and with the same devotion. Thomas turned 14 and then 15, and was already helping manage the cattle rotations with a competence that made the older hands on the ranch take him seriously, which he received without ego, because ego was not Thomas's way. He was becoming the kind of young man that people trusted on sight, which was partly his seriousness, and partly a quality of fundamental reliability that was his own particular thing, independent of anyone who had taught it to him. Clara was 12 and had decided she wanted to learn everything there was to know about horses, not just riding but the whole of it, their care and their nature and their training, and she had found in this a passion of the organizing kind, the kind that gives a person a direction. Nelson had begun teaching her what he knew about horse breeding and training, and she absorbed it with the intensity she brought to all things she cared about. In the spring, when Robert was 4 years old, Eudora discovered she was expecting again, their second child together, Robert's sibling, Thomas, and Clara's new arrival into the household. She told Nelson in the kitchen on a Thursday evening as she had told him about Robert, and he responded in the same way, going very still and then holding her, and the kitchen was warm around them and the stove ticked, and outside the spring Wyoming night was full of frogs and the smell of new grass. "How are you?" he said. "Completely well," she said, "and very happy." He pulled back to look at her face, checking that this was true because he always checked. "Also very happy," she said. He smiled. "Good." They told the children the next morning. Robert immediately announced that he wanted a brother, which he then modified to allow for a sister if she would agree to be interested in horses, which was apparently his primary criterion. Thomas asked the practical questions about timing and how things would need to be arranged, which were good practical questions that Eudora answered with the same practicality. Clara looked at Eudora for a long moment with a complex expression. "Are you frightened?" Clara asked. She was 12 and had developed the particular directness of a girl who had been watched by her mother doing hard things, and had learned that directness was the thing her mother respected. "No," Eudora said. "I was frightened the first time with each of you because I wasn't sure I could manage. Now I know I can." "Because Papa is here," Clara said. Eudora looked at her daughter and then at Nelson, who was watching this exchange from the doorway. "Because Papa is here," she agreed, "and because I am not afraid anymore." Clara nodded, satisfied, and went back to her breakfast. Their daughter arrived in October, on a day with the aspens golden along the creek, and the sky the particular clear blue of Wyoming autumn, and she was small and quiet in the specific way that suggested she was observing everything with great seriousness and forming conclusions. They named her Frances Margaret, Frances for Nelson's mother, who was still living in Colorado and who would visit in the spring, and Margaret for Eudora's grandmother, the one who had come from Virginia with a cast-iron skillet and the rose hip powder and the recipe that had started all of it. Robert received his sister with the resigned generosity of a boy who has been told he will love someone and has decided to believe it. Within 2 weeks, he was fiercely protective of her in the specific way of small boys with smaller sisters, sitting beside her cradle and reporting to Nelson with great gravity on any sounds she made that he considered suspicious. "She sneezed," he said on one occasion, standing in the doorway of the bedroom where Frances was sleeping. "That's what babies do," Nelson said. 3 times, Robert said. 3 is within normal range, Nelson said. Robert considered this. How do you know the range? Experience, Nelson said. With you and with your sister Clara. Robert absorbed this. Were you worried about me when I sneezed? He asked. Constantly, Nelson said. I was worried about you every moment for approximately the first 2 years. But I was fine, Robert said. You were fine, Nelson confirmed. As Francis will be. Robert looked into the room at his sleeping sister. Probably, he said, and Nelson managed to maintain his expression. The third harvest festival after the wedding was the one where Thomas entered the horse race and won it, which was not a surprise to anyone who had watched him ride over the past 4 years, but which caused considerable discussion in town about whether a boy of 15 had any business being that good on a horse. He collected the small prize with the same composure with which he did most things, and came back to where the family was gathered with a rare, full smile. Well done, Nelson said. The horse did most of it, Thomas said. That, Nelson said, is exactly the right way to think about it. Eudora watched them. This boy who was not Nelson's blood but who had been his son in every meaningful way for 4 years now. And this man who had never once treated Thomas as anything other than exactly what he was, and she felt the particular gratitude of witnessing something being done right. She entered the baking contest, as she entered every year, because it was her contest and it was her pie, and the $50 was by now less about necessity and more about the principle of a thing. And she won it, as she won it every year. And the town of Millhaven had come to regard her victory with the fond familiarity of a tradition, which she privately thought was both flattering and slightly irritating, because it ought to still be a contest. On the walk home from the third festival, with the children spread across the wagon and Francis asleep in Eudora's arms, and Robert in the back informing Thomas of his views on the horse race with the confidence of a 4-year-old who had watched it happen and felt qualified to analyze it, Nelson reached across and took Eudora's hand. The road was the same road it had always been, the north road out of Millhaven, running between the hills with the sage on either side and the mountains north of everything. The same road she had walked that first festival evening with 2 children and a basket and $50, the road he had ridden down on Doyle to offer Clara a seat in the saddle. "I've been thinking," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I've been thinking about the contest, the first one, what it meant." He looked ahead down the road the way he did when he was putting something into words carefully. "You entered that contest for $50 because you had 43 cents and 2 children and a winter coming. You made that pie because it was the best thing you had to offer and you needed something for it." "Yes," she said. "And I sat at that table," he said, "and I ate that pie and everything else stopped mattering." He turned to look at her. "I was there as a judge, and I forgot I was judging. I forgot there was a table and a contest and a crowd. There was just the pie, and then there was the thought of the person who had made it." He shook his head slightly. "I've never told you that. I've been meaning to." Eudora looked at him in the evening light, this man with his gray-green eyes and his absolute specific attention, this man who had come to her gate with honesty and gentleness and stayed. "You forgot the competition," she said. "Entirely," he said, "before I even looked for you." She thought about the widow she had been, walking to that festival with 43 cents and a careful, frightened heart, making the best thing she had from what she had been given by the grandmother she loved, hoping it would be enough. "It was my grandmother's pie," she said, "but it was my hope in it." "I know," he said. "That's what I tasted." She leaned her head against his shoulder, careful of the sleeping Francis, and they drove the rest of the way home in the early dark with the stars coming on one by one above the Wyoming hills. The double bar B grew and prospered in the years that followed, not in the flashy sense, but in the steady, real sense of a ranch that is well managed and well loved, and that has the benefit of 2 capable people, both fully invested in it. The eastern section that Nelson had bought from Callaway became the foundation of an expansion that, within 5 years, made the Double Bar be one of the more substantial ranching operations in the county, known for the quality of its cattle, and for the kitchen that Eudora ran with the same excellence she brought to everything. She baked. She baked constantly and with joy, and the Double Bar B kitchen was the kind of kitchen that people remembered long after they had visited it, the way certain kitchens are when they are the center of something. She taught Frances the recipe when Frances was 7, the same age she herself had been when her grandmother began to teach her, and Frances received it with the gravity appropriate to receiving something sacred. 3 pinches, Eudora said, her hands guiding her daughter's small ones over the jar of rose hip powder. Why 3? Frances asked. Because my grandmother said 3, Eudora said, and her grandmother said 3, and you will say 3. To my daughter, Frances said. To your daughter, Eudora confirmed. Clara became the best horsewoman in the county, and eventually, in her early 20s, began training horses professionally, which was unusual for a woman in the county at the time, but which she managed with the combination of excellence and complete indifference to others' opinions that had always been characteristic of her. She married a quiet, good man named Daniel Pritchard, who had come west from Ohio to work cattle, and who had the good sense to understand immediately what Clara was, and to love her fully for it. Thomas grew into exactly the man you would have predicted from the boy, solid and reliable, and with a deep, specific knowledge of land and cattle that made him sought after for his counsel at an age when most men were still learning. He worked the Double Bar B through his 20s, became Nelson's equal partner in the management of it, and in time found a young woman named Grace, a schoolteacher from Casper with red hair and strong opinions, who matched him in the specific way that people match when they are 2 different kinds of serious, and find it complementary rather than competitive. Robert remained, in adulthood, approximately as he had been in childhood, which was to say that he had the clarity and the boldness that comes from having grown up in a good house and knowing it. He went to study at a school in Denver, something that became possible as the ranch's fortunes grew, and came back with a head full of things he wanted to do and a practical set of skills to do them with. And he worked with Nelson and Thomas on the expansion plans for the Double Bar B with an energy that the older men received with a combination of enthusiasm and occasionally the need to apply the brake. Frances grew into a young woman of particular intelligence and an artistic sensibility that expressed itself in everything she touched, the way she arranged the garden that she had taken over from Eudora in her teenage years, the way she cooked, the way she dressed, the way she looked at things, and when she entered the Millhaven Harvest Festival baking contest for the first time at the age of 18, she brought the same pie her mother had always brought and won it. Of course she did, Nelson said when Eudora told him. Don't be smug, she said. I'm not smug, he said. I'm proud. Be proud then, she said, but not smug. He kissed her temple. Yes, ma'am. The contest that had started it all became, in the Hayes Barnett family, something that accumulated, meaning the way a river accumulates water, slowly and from many sources. Eudora entered it for 20 years, and she won it for 17 of them, and the 3 she didn't win she received with the grace of a woman who understood that the point of a thing is never only the winning. She retired from entering at the age of 50, which was a decision she made on her own terms, and in her retirement year, the Ladies' Committee of Millhaven asked her to be a guest judge, which she accepted with the wry amusement of a woman who could appreciate the symmetry of a thing. She sat at the judge's table that year with the mayor and the minister's wife, and tasted every entry with the specific, respectful attention that Nelson had taught her by example, looking for what was real in each one, the thing that belonged to somebody, the thing that had been passed down. She awarded the first prize to a young woman from the eastern part of the county, a girl of 20 named Anne, who had made a dried cherry and molasses cake that carried in it something Eudora recognized, the particular quality of food made from necessity, made from having something real to say with it. That girl needs the money, Eudora said afterward to Nelson. I know, he said. She'll be fine, Eudora said. She just needs to know she can win. Nelson looked at her for a moment with the expression she knew best, the one that had been directed at her for 20-odd years, warm and specific and entirely without performance. "That," he said, "is something I know something about." She laughed, which she did easily now, more easily than she had done when he met her, the laugh of a woman who has enough to laugh from. "You're a shameless man." "Only with you," he said. They walked home from the festival together as they had walked home from every festival for 20 years, sometimes with children beside them and sometimes alone, on the road north of Millhaven, where the sage grew on the hills and the mountains stood clear on the horizon. It was October and the aspens were gold, and the air had that particular sharpness of high-country autumn, and the road was familiar in the way of roads you have walked many times and loved. She took his hand. He was warm and solid beside her, this man with the gray-green eyes and the careful attention and the specific love, this man who had come to her pie table at a county fair and tasted what was real in what she made, and then found her in the crowd and told her what he had found there. This man who had appeared at her gate on a horse named Doyle and sat at her kitchen table and fixed her window frame and asked if he could court her properly. This man who had taken Thomas's serious questions seriously and taught Clara to ride and made a cradle with patient hands and been there in the blue hour before dawn when Robert announced himself. This man who was her husband and her partner and the person she had built the better half of her life with. The road went on ahead of them, familiar and real, and behind them the lights of Millhaven were coming on in the early dark, and ahead of them the double bar waited with its warm kitchen and its good stove and everything they had made of it, all the years and children and work and love of it. "I'm glad I entered that contest," she said. He squeezed her hand. "I'm glad you made that pie." "I'm glad you ate it," she said. "I'm glad I forgot the competition," he said. She leaned into him as they walked, and the road went on, and the mountains held still against the sky, and the Wyoming dark came down over everything like a blanket, like a benediction, like the end of a very long and very good day. Behind them, Millhaven's festival was still going. The fiddle player was still playing, something fast and sweet that carried on the cold air, the same song it always was, the one that made your feet want to move. Somewhere on the stage, a young woman was holding an envelope of prize money and feeling something she didn't have a word for yet, something that was not quite pride and not quite hope, but lived between them. And somewhere north of town, the double bar was lit in the early dark, its windows warm, and 4 children who were no longer children had gone back to their various lives from the festival, and 2 small grandchildren were visiting this weekend, Clara's little ones, who had spent the afternoon at the contest table staring at the pies with enormous eyes, and who were now, if the world was sensible, asleep in the back bedroom under the good quilts. Eudora thought about this as they walked, the way it had accumulated. The way one pie on one afternoon in October of 1882 had become this, all of this. The children and the ranch and the grandchildren and the 20 years of Saturdays, and the window frame he had fixed, and the snowdrops from the south-facing slope and the red coat and the $50 and the $50 and the $50. Each contest year. Each year a different kind of need, but always the same pie, always the same hands. Always the same recipe whispered on a deathbed in Virginia by a woman who had come west with nothing but what she knew and what she loved. She thought about what it meant to inherit something. Not just the recipe, but the knowledge behind it, the understanding that what you make with your hands and your learning, what you offer truly, has a value that cannot be measured only in prize money. Her grandmother had known that. Eudora had learned it. Frances was learning it now. And the man beside her, this particular man, had known it from the first taste. "She would have liked you," Eudora said. "My grandmother." He was quiet for a moment. "I hope so." "She liked people who paid attention," Eudora said. "She said that was the rarest thing, people who actually pay attention." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," he said. "She was," Eudora said. "She really was." The stars were fully out now, the great sweep of them that you only see in places far enough from city light to let the sky be what it is, and the road ahead was silver gray in the starlight. and the sage smelled cold and sharp. And Eudora Hayes, who was Eudora Barnett now and had been for 20 years, walked home in the Wyoming dark with her hand in her husband's hand, and the whole of her life around her like a garment made to fit, and she was not afraid. She had not been afraid for a very long time. They came to the lane that led down to the house, the same lane she had walked alone that first evening with Clara asleep against her shoulder and $50 in her pocket, and the house at the bottom of it had its lights on, which meant Francis was home, and the barn was settled for the night, and everything was as it should be. "Ready?" he said. She looked up at him in the starlight, at this face she knew better than any other face in the world, and she thought, yes. Not just to go inside, but to all of it, to whatever was still coming, to the years still ahead and the grandchildren still to arrive and the contests still to enter and the pies still to bake and the mornings still to wake up to with this man beside her. "Ready," she said, and they went home.